So what other comments have we, or questions have we got? Maybe something that Paul can chip in on?
Yeah, well, Paul will like this one. He'll love this.
Go on,
Chris Teig says, further discussion of McCartney II would be most welcome.
Well, now, I was going to say that what we should do today is we should also go back and maybe review some of our own discussions about some of these albums, and perhaps we've been a bit unfair about some of them. Now, Paul, I remember you when you listened to the very first podcast, you said to me, I think I could have made a better defence of McCartney II than Tim did on our very first episode.
Right, Paul, thanks for your criticism. Thank you. Anyway, no. I actually edited out, because I did a lot of editing on that as well, and basically I spoke for probably, and we do this a lot, when Stephen and I do this podcast, we can often speak for about 3 or 4 hours, and so the McCartney II discussion was about 10 times longer, and I just kind of cut it out, because partly I'd not said what I wanted to say about it, but I was more vociferous and articulate in its defence than is heard, and I think we just left it as it was for comedy value. You're
a very, 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 very poor apologist for Paul McCartney.
I don't remember saying that, Stephen, anyway. I think Stephen's just winding you up there. But the McCartney, I mean, what have you got against Paul McCartney, Stephen Wilson? That's what I want to know.
I don't have anything against...
Have you said anything positive about him in any of your
Nothing.
podcasts? I don't know.
Well, the thing is, okay, right, we've only talked about McCartney II, right, and Press to Play, an album which I've not even heard, okay? Now, I have read your book on Press to Play, and it doesn't make me want to go and listen to it, Paul, I've got to say.
Well, the funny thing is, Press to Play, I've actually got a bone to pick with Tim here, because he said... Press to Play is better than Tug of War, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard said about a McCartney.
Somebody else actually said, in what universe is Press to Play better than Tug of War? And I said, well, mine, clearly. I just kind of like its artificial art pop wankery, if that makes any sense. Tug of War, to me, didn't have the majesty or creativity or insanity of some of his 70s albums. You know, I quite like London Town. You know, I know, but
Tug of War has that craft work, that songwritery craft work. I mean, it does have the George Martin production, which makes it maybe sound a little bit old-fashioned or whatever. But Press to Play is a load of average songs sort of layered with Hugh Padgham production. And once you take the production away, which I do enjoy that kind of mid-80s production, but once you take it away, there's not actually that much there left.
I would agree, but this is my, Press to Play, you've opened your drawer, and there's a whole load of really fascinating green goop in there. With Tug of War, you've opened the next drawer, and it's kind of cardboard ironed underpants.
A nice metaphor. A nice metaphor.
Yeah.
I think I need to disabuse you guys of the notion that I've got something against Paul McCartney. Macca. Okay, listen, my favourite Beatles song is essentially a Paul McCartney solo performance, Blackbird. Okay?
Beautiful.
I love McCartney 1. If we've been talking about McCartney 1, I love it. Maybe I'm Amazed, one of the greatest songs ever written by anyone, I think. McCartney 2 is just not very good.
No. Coming up from McCartney 2, I think Coming Up stands, with any of his post-Beatles solo work. I think Coming Up is one of the best songs he's ever written after the Beatles.
Yeah, Waterfalls, it's the new Long and Winding Road. What are you on about?
McCartney 1, I mean, it's a charming album, and he's still got the kind of shadow of the Beatles, and he's there playing his bass and his piano in Abbey Road or wherever. But McCartney 2 is Paul kind of experimenting, learning how to play early sequencers, synthesizers. I mean, and sort of succeeding. And it's not really a mess. It's a creative, experimental, commercial success, which is
inventing
amazing.
Drum and bass, Stephen.
Coming Up got John Lennon out of the studio recording Double Fantasy. I mean, that's how good it was.
I think I was slightly against it from the beginning because Tim was making such preposterous claims for it, as he just has again there, that McCartney II invented drum and bass.
I think Goldie, Ronnie Size, they still cite it as the key album.
I think if you listen to Check My Machine, which is a B-side from that record, that's like Gorillaz sort of 25 years earlier.
Oh, no, you're doing it too now. Look, I would be the first to admit it's got some lovely songs on it. Waterfalls is indeed lovely. Coming Up is a great pop song. Band on the Run, great album. Ram, masterpiece. Masterpiece. I'm just not really... What about McCartney III, Paul? Have you got anything to say about McCartney III?
I do quite like it, but I think the sad fact is Paul McCartney's voice just, is
gone.
It's no longer the wonderful instrument it once was. And so therefore he doesn't create the melodies that he once created. And I think, I did enjoy the record. I actually really liked the remix version as well that came out. But the sad thing is, you can't. Every time a new McCartney album is announced, you're measuring your expectations, you're lowering them a little bit because you just know that his days are gone a bit.
I think he's one of those artists a bit, and in this case, there are parallels between him and people like Neil Young and Lou Reed while he was still alive, and Bowie also. Is that I think every time they release an album, the fan base is desperate to proclaim it a return to form, aren't they? And that desperation, I think, sometimes makes you listen through rose-tinted ears, if such a thing is possible.
I know. I mean, there's a wonderful track at the end of McCartney III called "When Winter Comes," and I listened to the whole album and thought, yeah, this is pretty good in places. It's it's experimental, it's interesting. He has to do a bit more interesting things because he can't craft a brilliant pop song in the way that he used to. So it's quite experimental and quite nice. But then at the end there was this song called "When Winter Comes," and it was beautiful, and his voice was beautiful, and I was thinking, wow, I was almost brought me to tears listening to how good it was. And then I realised it was an old song from 1992 that he'd shoved on the end of the record. And it was kind of like, well, okay, I understand why that sounds so good now, because it's the Paul McCartney of nearly 30 years ago.
But I think some artists manage to work with their ageing voices. So people like Johnny Cash, Leonard Cohen, Scott Walker, their later works were as good as their earlier works. And arguably, Bob Dylan, in a sense, aging hasn't necessarily ravaged his voice. He never had a singer's voice, and he's managed to make aging work for him. And I think it's kind of interesting that McCartney had such a sweet, beautiful voice that perhaps that's one of the issues.
All the touring he's been doing over the last decade, he doesn't seem to change the key of the songs that he sings. And I don't really think that's helped very much, to be honest, with his voice.
I mean, there are certain singers, aren't there, where age makes no difference. Tom Waits, Neil Young, they sounded like 70-year-old men at the beginning of their career. So, I mean, in that sense, I suppose McCartney had a lot more to lose. I
mean, it's very cruel, I think, the way that singers and songwriters lose their voice. And I mean, I know it's just Mother Nature and time and everything, but it's a cruel blow when that gets taken away from you, I think.
True, but it doesn't always happen. And obviously we're seeing with an artist like Nick Cave, where actually his work, he's grown into it, I think, as he's developed as an artist. In his 60s, he's arguably more creative than he was in his 30s.